One tweak that inheritance throws into our code is the management of constructors. So sometimes you'll have some code that works perfectly fine. You'll add a constructor in, then all of a sudden everything breaks. And let's talk about why that is. So when I go to assemble an object in inheritance hierarchy, that object, as we said, comes from part of the child, but also part of the parent. So when our hourly employee class here, in this case, extends out the employee class, part of that class comes from the parent, and then part of it comes from the child. This is just the attributes here, and obviously you get all of the methods as well. And so when we have complicated inheritance hierarchies, it doesn't change that. There's always these parts. So if in this case, I have a big involved inheritance hierarchy, and if I go create a new pig object, well, I need to go create a pig part of it, but then I also need to create a vertebrate part of it, and I also need to create a animal part of it. So to some degree, the call sort of kind of does that. We go to the pig, we go to the vertebrate, we go to the animal, but also we have to do the opposite as well. The animal has to be first, and then the vertebrate, and the pig. And so think of it this way: um, your grandparents have to be born before your parents has to be born before you. But that being said, if I want to know your lineage, I got to talk to you and then find out who your parents were, and then go talk to your grandparents, right? It's kind of a chicken and egg thing when it comes to objects. So the way object-oriented programming languages handle that is when I go and call a constructor, like an hourly employee in this case, go back to that example, what happens is there's a call, the very first line must be a call to the superclass. So right here, there's an implicit call that goes up to when you go build a new hourly employee, it starts by going to this constructor over here for public hourly, right down here. Here, let me actually I'll annotate this right here. So I start by coming. Ooh, sorry, I need to pick up pen. I start by coming to here, right, and then I jump up with an implicit call to employee. So if I run this code, you can see hourly employee gets printed out after the employee constructor. So the employee constructor runs first, then the hourly constructor comes first. And so what happens in Java, at least, is there's what's called an implicit call to super, super being the parent's constructor. That implicit call only works when the parent constructor has no parameters, like it does in this case. The employee class has no parameters. But if the class has parameters, then I have to call it explicitly. So in this case, the call to super, I take one of the parameters, in this case given to me by the caller, and I pass that down into an ID, which then goes to super, which then gets passed up to the employee class. And this is really, really common to have a cascading of constructor values that come into a child class and just gets passed up to the parent class right away. It's also possible for the child class to pick a value to send up to the parent class, but it has to happen on the first line of the code. It actually makes constructors kind of challenging in inheritance hierarchies because you have to be able to plan it out accordingly. The very first line of code has to know what's happening in that superclass. So the alternative to that is you create a protected method. So the constructor of the parent calls down the methods down below, either as part of the constructor or later on. And it can be kind of tricky at times, but that's where some careful planning might come into play. The point being, though, as we saw before, is the first call to create an object goes to that object's constructor, but immediately the first line of that call goes to the super class, and it goes all the way up to the top of the hierarchy. And then after that constructor finishes, then you build your way down the object. So I have to build my employee part before I build my hourly employee part. I have to build my animal part before I build my vertebrate part before I build my pig part. But the call first goes to pig, then to vertebrate, then to animal, then you kind of go back down the chain. So not the easiest thing, but as I said, the best way to check it out is just something little simple like this by doing a print line. And if you get that print line to show up, then you start to understand a little bit better. So remember that and play with it as you start to play with constructors in inheritance hierarchies.